Hello and welcome to a tutorial video on Kiko's knitting podcast. Today I want to show you how to finish the Rio Calina Cowl. In my first video I showed you how to knit this little scarf, how to do the cables without a chart, and I just want to remind you that in my first video I said to knit 110 centimeters, but it should be 86 centimeters. It should be 34 inches and not 44. I made a mistake there, I'm sorry. If you have knit a longer scarf, it doesn't matter, you can still use it and sew it together. I'll show you how to do that. I've already put in 2 markers to mark off the 3/3 of the scarf. It would be enough to put 1 marker so you know where to start sewing, because then you just sew until one of the parts is ended. I'll show you in a minute, but first we'll do the cast off. Cat Body says to do Jeny surprisingly stretchy bind off, and I'm going to show you how that works. The trick with Jeny surprisingly stretchy bind off is to give every stitch a yarn over, an additional yarn over, and we haven't knit in stockinette stitch, but we've knit and purl stitches. We will do different yarn overs depending on which kind of stitch we are looking at. To cast off this way is in front, before you have a knit stitch, you do a yarn over the wrong way, in a way. This is the way we usually do a yarn over for like a lace pattern, but for a knit stitch we will do the yarn over the other way round. So we go with the needle like this, so that the yarn will come from the back to the front. Then I knit my first stitch and I will pull the yarn over the stitch, so it has a little collar there. Then I'll do the same for the next stitch. I have this other yarn over, knit a stitch, and then I pull the yarn over the stitch. It gets a little collar, and then I pull the first stitch over the second stitch the way I usually do when I cast off stitches. Now we have 2 purl stitches, so I'll do the normal yarn over the way we're used to doing that. I purl my stitch, pull the yarn over the stitch, pull my first stitch over the second stitch, and then do another yarn over. I purl a stitch, and then the yarn over and the stitch go over the stitch I just purled. And you can do that a little quicker if you do your yarn over this way for the knit stitch. And now I can pull the yarn over and the stitch over my second stitch in one movement. I do a yarn over, I knit a stitch, pull both over the stitch. Then I'll do the other yarn over, purl a stitch, and you can pull both at the same time. If that's too hard for you, don't get your needle into both loops at the same time. You can do it one by one, the way I showed at the beginning. It's not a race, but if it works, it'll just go that much quicker. And just remember to do the yarn overs in a different way depending on whether you have a knit or a purl stitch next. So with the knit stitch I'll do this other way, this other yarn over, and repeat that for the next knit stitch, and then for the purl stitch do the other yarn over. I'm not quite sure why Cat Body wanted this really elastic bind off for this cowl, because the cast off edge is at the edge of the cowl. It's not like on top or below, so it's not that important to be that stretchy. But on the other hand, if she designed it this way, this is the way I'm going to do it, and I'm sure there will be a reason, and I maybe just can't think of it at the moment. And it's not bad just knowing how to do that. It's great for toe-up socks. is also very good if you have a neckline that you want to cast off, or maybe if you knit a hat top down, it would also be really handy to be able to do this cast off. I'm sure you can think of even more instances where it's good to be able to know this. I'm just quickly going to finish this now. Now I'm at the last 2 stitches, 2 purl stitches. So I'll do the traditional yarn over, purl my last stitch, pull the 2 loops over, oops, I'll do it one by one because it doesn't work. Now I've finished the cast off. You can see it's really elastic and stretchy. Now I'm going to cut the yarn off, and I'll cut it off so long that I can use this bit of yarn for my seam. This should be enough. Snip it through, and I'm not going to pull the yarn through my loop, but I'll just pull on the loop itself and pull the yarn through. I won't have this little extra bit that sometimes is not necessary. So the question is, how am I going to seam that together as a loop? So what you do is you fold it into thirds. So 1/3 goes down, 1 goes up. So it's a bit difficult with my camera to show this, but you can imagine if I put 1/3 like this and 1/3 like that, I'm going to push one end up and pull the other end down, and the point where those 2 pieces meet, that's where I want to sew the seam, and in the back I will have just half the width. So the lower bit of that part is going to be sewn onto the upper part of that bit. So this is the way my little scarf is folded, and this is where my seam is going to end. So that's what I'm saying. The second marker isn't as important because it doesn't matter where I end with my seam, but it's important to know where to start. And what you could do is just clip the piece together and try it on, or you just go ahead and start sewing. I used this really big needle so it's easy to see. I'm going to turn the whole thing round because I tend to sew from right to left as I'm right-handed. Now let's have a look at the edge. I did not use the, or the way I did the last and first stitch is that I purled the last stitch and then just slipped the first stitch of every row. So the stitches that I see fit the pattern. So now I want to figure out which loop to use for sewing. So this is my first knit stitch. This is the second knit stitch from the other side, and this row ended with 2 purl stitches that sort of get hidden here. And because of the edge I knitted, the purl stitches sort of disappear. So with these 2 knit stitches, I'm going to use the knit stitch that's at the outer edge. At first I wanted to use both of those loops, but I didn't like the way the seam looked, so I'm just going to use this outer half of the first knit stitch. And I'm going to do the same on the other half, the other third of my scarf. So this is where my marker is. These are the purl stitches. That's the first knit stitch. This is the second knit stitch. And I'm going to use this very first loop of my knit stitch. So I have to decide. I'll start from this loop and then go straight into the outer. So let's start again. This is one knit stitch, this is the other knit stitch, and I'm going to use the lower loop of the first knit stitch, and then I'm going to use I'm not going to use the first stitch here, but I'm going into the very top. I will use that stitch. Yeah, you have to start somewhere. Doesn't really matter. And the reason I'm going from top to bottom is that I want to go up and down so that the seam is will look the same from both sides. So it doesn't matter how you wear your cowl, it will look nice on both sides. So let's check again. This is the first knit stitch, that's the second knit stitch. Whoops. So this is the lower bit. This is the stitch that I've already used, so I'm going into that stitch. With sewing, I think the hardest thing is to see where to put your needle and which loop to use. So I tried to not pull on that yarn too much, so I can still see which loop I used, so I can just use the next loop. And the same down here, I see I went into that loop, so I'll use a loop one further to the left. And now I'm going to pull on my yarn, and so those two have closed up, but those two are still visible, so I can just go one further to the left. I won't use the upper loop but the lower loop, so I will always put the needle into the same line. So in the end, it doesn't really matter to sort of get the right loop, but just make sure that you use the same loop, and that will make it look nice. And as long as you do it, if you keep going into the same loop, it will look nice and it doesn't really matter. But now I think I've used the wrong one. I used the upper loop. So sometimes I'm going back. I'll undo that stitch and check again. I think I will have, I have to use the lower loop. This one went up and I thought I had to use that one, but I have to use this one. So it's not so important to have the correct one, but I just want to make sure that I keep in line with the same stitch that I used before. It's not so clear to know which one to use, but I'm trying to use the lower one on both edges of my little scarf. I'll use this loop and that loop, and I think once you start going, you sort of get into the rhythm of things, and you will start recognizing where your edge is. And not pulling the yarn too tight as you go always helps. And then every now and then you can pull it a bit tighter, but then I will pull in. This would be pulling too much, so I always pull in the other direction as well to make sure things stay flexible. So you can see there is a seam there, but I think it looks quite nice. It doesn't look too bad on the other side, and it's not too thick. You can't really feel it. It's and I think, and when I tried using both the loops, it felt a lot thicker and I didn't like it. You could do that if you wanted a bit tighter. I think it wouldn't matter when you wear it. But this yarn is so soft, you can't really go wrong there. But I think basically you have to find out where you want to put your needle and then just keep doing the same. And I will just quickly finish the seam and I'll show you how to finish. Now I'm getting to the end of my seam, so I don't really get quite to the marker, but that's not important. I'm not going to try and fix that because it doesn't have to be exactly 1/3. It just needs to be sewn together so that it does become a loop, a cowl, so you can wear it. So I'm trying to pull it tight, but not too tight. I think now I'm going to go into this edge and I'll use the same loop that I had used before, and just to make it this much tighter at the corner. And then I'm going to show you how I weave in my yarn end, and then I'm already almost done with my Rio Calina Cowl. So I didn't get quite to that point, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to turn it around. It doesn't really have a right and a wrong side. You just have to decide which side to use. And with a rib pattern like this, I like to put my needle into one side of the knit stitch like this. Then the yarn is almost completely invisible, and I won't just do it in one section. So I'm going to move over to the next knit stitch column, and when I get there I will do the same, that I put the needle into 1/2 of the knit stitch. Make sure you don't pull on the yarn too much when you pull it through so it doesn't distort the knitting. And I will move over to the left 1/2 a stitch, and I'll just weave my needle through this 1/2 stitch. And just to be extremely safe, I'll just go through one more column of stitches, and then you pull it tight, but not too tight. Make sure if it's too tight it will look weird, so make sure it's flexible there, not too tight. And then when I snip it off, I'll let a little bit of the yarn there so it can still move a little. If you cut it off too tight, it's always dangerous that you could cut into your knitting, and it might slip to the other side of the fabric. And I'll just have to weave in my other end, and then I'm finished. It's really difficult to see on my tiny screen, but you can see how this folds over when you wear it. If you want to see the finished cowl, then you can have a look at my you can watch my episode 129 or 28, 128 or 129. You should be able to see the finished object. I hope you understood what I was trying to explain, and I'll see you in the next one.